So now we arrive at Psalm 5. We've looked at the first four Psalms, and what we've really been noting is how connected these Psalms are. And so we will continue that work today. And once again, the header actually has quite a bit going on with it. In English, it reads, "To the choir master for the flutes, a psalm of David." But let's take a look at the structure of this. In Hamilton, in his commentary, he talks about how it has this balanced construction to it. But Boise, in his commentary in page 44, he says, "An outline is helpful for understanding the text. Psalm 5 consists of 5 strophes or stanzas. And note that it's 5. As Labuschagne is going to point out, 5 is actually prominent in this psalm. In the 3 of these, the first, the third, and the fifth, so every other, the psalmist is standing face to face before God with only God in view. In the 2 alternating stanzas, the second and fourth, he glances sideways at the wicked, as it were, and develops contrasts between God and the wicked in stanza 2 and the righteous and the wicked in stanza 4. And Boise continues that Psalm 5 is another morning psalm, like Psalm 3. Since the following psalm is another evening psalm, we therefore have prayers for morning and evening in Psalms 3 through 6. It is a way of saying that our entire day, from the rising to the setting of the sun, should be prayerful. Spurgeon said, "Prayer should be the key of the day and the lock of the night. Devotion should be both the morning and the evening star." And in the Blackwell commentary, they point out that it was this psalm's title that caused the most interest. Jerome, for example, notes that the Jews have failed to interpret properly "unto the end" as referring to Christ's coming. We looked at this last time in the Greek, that's the "to the choir master" language. And also from the Latin, "for her that obtains her inheritance aright." And what it's referring to is this language of "for the flutes." If we were to look at the Greek translation here, it translates it "for the end on behalf of the inheritance," a psalm of David. So that's quite different, but the early church then took that as a reference to the church. From this, a common approach, for example, in Augustine, Chrysostom, Cassiodorus, is to read the psalm through the feminine form as the voice of the church, with references to what the bride, the church, will receive from the bridegroom, Christ. For example, Cassiodorus reads verse 7 as the church turning to Christ. From this ecclesial reading, it was possible to view the enemies as heretics, using verse 9 more specifically than Paul in Romans. Jerome writes that Arius, Eunomius, and other heretics have tongues like arrows, jaws like empty tombs. But moving to Labuschagne with some of the number stuff, he says the psalm opens with a 5-word verse line and is made up of 15 verse lines, 3 times 5, with 10, 2 times 5, words in the middle verse line. Moreover, exactly 5 words are explicitly used to speak about God, and cantos 1 and 2 have 65 words. To crown it all, the name Yahweh appears exactly 5 times. Finally, the editor of the Psalter was fully aware of this because, in my opinion, he deliberately provided the psalm with a 5-word heading. This is not surprising, seeing that we have to do with the 5th psalm in the Masoretic numbering. So this is one of those things where it's like, okay, as far as this goes, I don't think you can deny it. It's very obvious that it's built around the number 5, and of course, it's the 5th psalm. But to the psalm proper, let's start at verse 1. "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God, for to you do I pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch." So let's go ahead and start taking this apart. Hamilton here in his commentary, page 124, is pointing out that the term at the end of 5:1, our translation says groaning, but meditation or murmuring, perhaps musing, the CSB goes with sighing, is related to the verb used in Psalm 1:2 to describe the blessed man meditating on the Torah. The use of this term indicates that David is calling on the Lord to consider his meditation on the Torah. So that's really interesting because we note this, that in Psalm 1, it's on his Torah. And notice it's his Torah. It's the blessed man's Torah that he meditates day and night. And it's this term here. Now, it's related to this term. It's not exactly the same term. But when we look at this in Psalm 1:2, we go down to Psalm 2. It's the wicked here. The nations are raging and the peoples are plotting in vain. It's the same term that's used up here of meditating. And so they're meditating on ways to rebel, whereas the blessed man is meditating on the Torah. And here in Psalm 5, he's asking God to consider his groaning, his murmuring, his meditating. And let's move down here to this language of I prepare a sacrifice, because that's really not what it's saying, quite literally. If you notice, as I click on this, there's nothing there. So that's kind of an interpretive translation. Reardon has some good comments on this. He says, Hebrew verb translated here as stand, in our case, it's prepare, bears the sense of setting in order, used without direct object here. It is very succinct, so succinct that English translations or translators have sometimes felt the need to expand on it. Thus, the King James Version paraphrases it as, I direct my prayer unto thee, and the NIV as, I lay my requests before you, the ESV, I prepare a sacrifice. The Greek and Latin versions used in the Christian liturgical traditions better preserve the original sense of simply standing in proper order in the presence of God. To this is added a certain note of vigilance to keep watch. These two verbs, to take one's stand and to keep watch, set the tone for how to begin the day of prayer. It is important that this tone be set early in the morning, the hour of rising. Over and over, the Psalms speak of prayer as the day's first task. Rise up, my glory. Awaken lute and harp. I myself will awaken the dawn. I will sing aloud of your mercy in the morning. In the morning shall my prayer come before you, to show forth your loving kindness in the morning, and so forth. And that's Psalm 108, I believe. And now down to verse 4. For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. And concerning this language of shall not stand before your eyes, this brings back to mind Psalm 2:2, where the kings of the earth literally take their stand against the Lord and his anointed. In the language of you hate all evildoers, this looks forward to Psalm 6:8. They're translated as all workers of evil, but it's the exact same phrase. You destroy those who speak lies. Again, similarly, this looks back to Psalm 4:2. David asks how long his enemies will love vain words and seek after lies. So quite a bit of connections looking forward and backward. Moving down to verse 7, but I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down toward your holy temple in the fear of you. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness. Because of my enemies, make your way straight before me. Here, Hamilton's going to point out how the affirmations in this section match the negations in verses 4-6, point for point. So Yahweh hates wickedness, but David experiences Yahweh's abundant loving kindness, and that's Hesed here. No evil sojourns with Yahweh, but David will enter his house. The boastful will not stand before Yahweh's eyes, but David will bow down to his holy temple. Yahweh destroys liars and abominates those who shed blood and deceive, but David fears Yahweh, and that fear of Yahweh keeps him from such destructive tactics. And this language of bowing down toward the holy temple, Longman points out here that Daniel illustrates the practice of bowing towards Jerusalem in Daniel 6:10. But picking up with Reardon, he says, when the sun rises, it shines on the believer already at prayer. This is normally how the day begins. It is also the essential meaning of those later lines in the psalm, I will enter into your house in the multitude of your mercies. In the fear of you, I will bow myself down toward your holy temple. To pray is to enter the house of God. The context of this worship, nonetheless, is still the life of struggle with evil. When the Christian rises, it is always on the battlefield. In concerning this language of holy temple, first off, it hooks back to Psalm 34, his holy hill, and Psalm 2:6, Zion, my holy hill. But there's obviously some discussion about this since the temple didn't exist in David's day. So how do we take this? And Boise points out there's four possible explanations. One, the psalm was not actually written by David. This is the view of most modern commentators. Two, although the psalm was originally written by David, David's language has been altered or updated to fit the needs of later worshipers. Three, the terms for God's dwelling that had been used when the ark was at Shiloh lived on as traditional expressions. Compare 1 Samuel 1 and 7 and verse 9, where the words house and temple both occur. This view is particularly attractive since in 2 Samuel 12:20 the word house is used of the very tent David erected to hold the ark after it had been brought to Jerusalem. And 4, Psalm 5 is not referring to an earthly house or temple at all, but to the heavenly temple where God actually dwells. And we could add a fifth that's kind of related to this one, and that's the way some of the early church saw it as a reference to Christ, the true temple, the true heavenly temple. But either way, there are quite a bit of ways that you could take that. And then this language of the fear of you, Psalm 2:11 instructs the kings and rulers of the earth to serve the Lord with fear. Again, hooking back to Psalm 2. Maybe no one will find this as interesting as I did, but the Blackwell commentary points out that this has had an interesting reception history, this verse here, verse 8. The whole of verse 8 was used in the first nocturne of the office of the dead. So the first word, and I don't know how to say that, came to refer to the recitation of the entire office and the obligation to pray for the dead. From this usage, the word dirge, as in funeral dirge, was derived. So in the Latin, this was in the Latin, it was basically direct me, O Lord. And so that came to become dirge. And that's where we get the term dirge from, is from this particular line. And concerning the language of enemies here, Hamilton writes, this prayer for Yahweh to lead him is motivated by David's awareness that he is being watched, and these watchers are so hostile that the term is typically rendered adversaries. And then in the footnote, he says, all 6 occurrences or instances of this term are in the Psalms, and the NAS renders each instance foes. BDB glosses the term insidious watcher because they connect the word etymologically to a term meaning to watch stealthily or to lie in wait. And then make your way straight before me. Of course, this discussion of your way or the way hooks back to Psalm 1:1 and 1:6, the way of the sinners, the way of the righteous, the way of the wicked, as well as Psalm 2:12, where the wicked are destroyed in the way. And then moving down to verse 9, for there is no truth in their mouth, their inmost self is destruction, their throat is an open grave, they flatter with their tongue. Hamilton points out that there is a chiastic structure to these 4 phrases. For there is in their mouth no reliability. That mirrors what their tongues cause, as he translates it, slipperiness. And the ESV here, they flatter with their tongue. And then in the center, within them is destruction. And then their throat is an open grave. So it mirrors quite nicely. Down to verse 10, make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Because of the abundance of their transgressions, cast them out, for they have rebelled against you. And here, Hamilton is quoting Othmar Kill, who observed that the Psalms often attribute the failure of the wicked not to the direct intervention of Yahweh, but to the operation of the order established by God at creation. The evil which originates with the wicked creates a fateful chain of events which ultimately turns against the offender himself. And of course, their own counsels here connects back to Psalm 1:1, the counsel of the wicked. Because of the abundance of their transgressions, cast them out. Longman, commenting on this, he says he further calls on God to banish them using the verb that means to force out and is used elsewhere in reference to the exile from the promised land, whose background is found in the covenant threat that rebellion is punishable by expulsion. That's Deuteronomy 34. Verse 11, let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exalt you. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover him with favor as with a shield. And of course, verse 11, all who take refuge in you, links back to Psalm 2:12. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Of course, the Messiah. And as we've noted now multiple times, we normally take refuge in the Lord, but in Psalm 2, we're taking refuge in the Anointed One, which of course makes sense because the Anointed One is, in fact, the Lord. Basic Trinitarian thinking. And then bless the righteous here. Hamilton We'll have a nice concluding idea here. Reading Psalm 5 as continuing the themes introduced in Psalms 1 and 2, as I have done here, sharpens the relevance of Paul's use of the thoughts of Psalm 5 because he quotes them having asserted that none seek God and all have together turned aside and become worthless. Paul likely saw all sinners as having gathered themselves together against Yahweh and his anointed, and the open grave of their throats and the deceit of their tongues would naturally be their speaking against Yahweh's king. We would expect the seed of the serpent to have the venom of asps under their lips. It's Romans 30:13. Psalm 5 portrays Yahweh's king responding to difficulty with prayer to and trust in Yahweh. The psalm teaches that Yahweh will certainly protect his king, 5:12. The portrayal and the teaching of this psalm inspire those who align themselves with Yahweh's king to pray as David did. And I thought this is really interesting because this connects back to the Rear Dawn quote that I wanted to move back to. And I hate getting into the topic of like Calvinism and stuff like that, but I'm not a Calvinist. And it would be easy to read what Hamilton is saying through a Calvinistic lens. I'm not sure where he's at all on this issue, but Paul is talking about how no one seeks after God in Romans 3. And so he's going to find ammunition in Psalm 5. But notice in Psalm 5, it is being juxtaposed. Not everyone is doing these things. These are the wicked. These are people who have aligned themselves with the serpent. They've rebelled against the king. They turned aside and became worthless. In light of that, I found Reardon's comments kind of funny to me because he is Orthodox of some kind. I'm not sure what he is, Russian, Greek, Eastern, but he's going to use John 17 in a very Calvinistic way, the way some Calvinists use this. Now, not all, because some Calvinists will acknowledge that within the context, Jesus is actually praying for his disciples. It's very kind of limited in a way, even though that there is this application that goes beyond that moment. He is specifically talking about his disciples, his 12 disciples. But you'll sometimes have Calvinists read John 17 as the elect in their system. But it's funny because Reardon, not having that dialectic of Calvinism, Arminianism, stuff like that, he actually reads this kind of in a Calvinistic way, on one hand, reading basically believers into Jesus' prayer, but in a very un-Calvinistic way in how he phrases this. Let's just take a look at what he says. He writes, when the psalmist prays for the destruction of the wicked, this is not his personal sentiment, so to speak. It is not a prayer of private vindictiveness, but of foundational justice. It is a plea that God vindicate his own moral order. When Jesus refused to pray for the world, John 17:9, he was recognizing the existence of those who, willfully, unrepentant, and deliberately hard of heart, have placed themselves beyond hope. Inveterate sinning against the light, unrepented evil, does exist in human hearts, and God hates it. He hates it vehemently. Jesus on the cross had not one word to say to the blasphemous, unrepentant thief. And so while he does read this kind of the way Calvinists do, at least as far as the believers go, the unbelievers, he's very much placing the blame on the unbeliever. It's because they deliberately do this. They willfully are unrepentant. They've placed themselves beyond hope. Now, I know that the Calvinists would talk about the idea of compatibilism and things like that. I think it can be read that way, but you kind of have to read it into it that way, in my opinion. But that is that issue, although I do want to quickly look at some of Labuschagne's work in the Gematria stuff, because there's actually quite a bit going on in this psalm. As he points out here, the two middle words are the first words of the middle colon, which may, for good reasons, be regarded as the psalm's meaningful center. So the center of the poem, he thinks, is, I will worship at your holy temple in awe of you. Although he does extend and say it is possible to see it as this. As for me, through your great love, I may enter your house. I may worship at your holy temple in awe of you. So a larger sinner there. He says, however, I have a preference for the middle colon because it happens to be the 17th colon, being embraced by 17 cola, and consists of exactly 5 words, which is most significant, as I shall explain in the next observation, which we already looked at, the uses of 5. But of course, the 17 is rather interesting. Of course, a divine number, divine name number. And there's actually quite a bit of that going on in here. So here is pointing out the occurrences of this. Now, his verse system, he counts the heading as a verse, as verse 1. So all of his verse numbering is going to be off from the way we would normally look at it in our translations. So this, for instance, is verse 1 through 6 in probably your Bible. But you have 17 words here for verses, I guess, 3 through 4. And then 3 through 5 are 26. So, of course, you have the two different divine numbers. Verse 3 through 6 would be 34 words, or 2 times 17, which is followed by 26 words in verses 6 and 8, or 6 through 8. Of course, again, 17, 26, both divine numbers, divine name numbers. And then he points out here the Yahweh Echad formula, which is one, the Hebrew word for one. So like the Shema, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, which is here 39, because the Hebrew word for one is 13. The value of it is 13. Of course, the divine number 26. So you add those together, you get 39. He's saying that this can be detected in the 39 words of verses 1 through 5, 13 in verses 1 and 2, or 1 through 2, and 26 in verses 3 through 5. Additionally, the formula appears explicitly in the compositional formula of verses 7 through 10, 39 words with 26 before and 13 after the atnach. This is like these are the markings for like if you're reading it. So this isn't native to the actual text itself. And in fact, most commentators that pay a lot of attention to structuring and stuff like that within the Psalms, they often ignore this because, again, this wasn't native to the original text. This was something put in later. But Labuschagne puts a lot of emphasis on this because you have interesting things like this happening if you pay attention to it. And so let's just take a look at an example here. So in this chart he has going on, this is before the atnach, and this is going to be after, words before and after. And let's see, find an example here. This right here is the mark. I'll zoom in on this in the video, but that would be the marking. So you have 3 words, and then you have the pause, and then 2 more. So it's almost like a rhythm to the text. I just find it really compelling that you have so many interesting numbers and structural things happening when you pay attention to the atnach. So the question is, how exactly did that happen? How is it that you have these concentrations of interesting number things happening? Like, again, for instance, having 26 before and 13 after. It seems as if there is some kind of rhythm underneath the text. Now, you could argue that the Masoretes later down the line placed the atnach in ways that would make these numbers pop out like that. But I don't know. If anybody knows Hebrew, I would be interested in your opinion on that, if you think that it could be reverse engineered that way. The Masoretes later finding, like creating a rhythm out of nothing, because I don't see that being the case. That rhythm that the later Masoretes are detecting, here's where we put the pauses, is already in the text itself. And it just so happens, I don't think it's a coincidence, but it just so happens that you have, again, these interesting things happening with some of the numbers. So were the Masoretes reverse engineering to create these rhythms, or were these rhythms native to the text and they just happen to be that way? And they are just discovering it rather than creating it. But in addition to the stuff, he has that verses 3 through 5, you have 26 words again. But the way it's divided is precisely the two basic components of the divine name. So 15 YH, 11 WH. Moreover, the 26 words in subordinate clauses divide into 11, verses 1 through 8, and 15, verses 9 through 12. That one's really interesting. Divine numbers feature additionally in the following instances. This would be the entirety of the psalm. So even though it says 2 through 13, again, because of the heading, it's actually 1 through 12. But that's 34 words after the atnach. Again, 2 times 17. You have 26 words in the subordinate clauses, which you just mentioned above. And verses 4 through 12, you have 85 words, or 5 times 17. Of course, remember, 5 is prominent in this psalm, being Psalm 5, and 17, again, divine number. As already noted, the name Yahweh occurs 5 times, El occurs once, and Elohim twice. That is the number stuff, and that is Psalm 5. Hopefully That wasn't too exhaustive, but I will see you guys next time.